before we get into the specifics of your latest book, Blood for Blood, can we just talk about how well you combine historical fiction and fantasy? A lot of readers have said how no other author would be able to do that as well as you. Was it hard to balance the two in order to make the story believable?
Well, so Wolf by Wolf really started out as just a story that I was writing for myself in a way. I have always loved history. I grew up, I had really terrible history teachers actually in school. They weren't that fantastic. I had in honors U.S. history, my teacher, she hated war and she thought it was gross. And so she was like, let's just skip all of the wars. And really, like, all that honors U.S. history is wars. So we just studied the Jazz Age for all year and watched movies. But despite that, my love of history survived intact. So I just read up a lot, especially World War II has always fascinated me. So I've spent a lot of my time just researching that, and also as a child growing up, fantasy books were my biggest, the ones that I just devoured and I loved so much. And so one of the series that I actually read before writing Wolf by Wolf was Scott Westerfeld's Leviathan series, and it's basically a series where he writes about World War I in a way, but he crosses it over with like steampunk and various elements that are speculative and not purely historical. And when I finished those books, I was like, what if I approached World War II in a manner that was speculative and not necessarily like true, like not pure historical fiction? And so that's kind of the brain process that led me to doing that. But yeah, at the time, besides the Scott Westerfeld's books, there were really no alternate history, World War II or YA, and certainly none that wove fantasy through it. So it was definitely a big risk, like writing it, and I wanted to honor the subject matter and to do it well. So that was definitely something I went into very mindfully at the start. So.
It was very, very, very believable.
Thank you.
I love the whole way through it. So let's move on to how Wolf by Wolf ended. It feels like the best place to start. It was very much a cliffhanger. Where can Yael go now? Did you always know that the story would be conveyed in two parts? That her and her resistant voices would need so many pages to get through their journey? Yeah,
so Wolf by Wolf and Blood for Blood were, I sold them to my publisher as a set, and so I always knew, and I don't even really consider Blood for Blood a sequel, I consider it like an extension. It's like all one story in my mind, but like Wolf by Wolf is part one and Blood for Blood is part two. And so it was always supposed to, the end of Wolf by Wolf was always what I thought it would be. Actually, that was one of the first things I knew, but the twist, and I won't give it too much of it away for those of you who haven't read it, but the twist was always, I always knew that the twist was coming, and just sort of wrote the race leading up to that. And then Blood for Blood was a little bit more like, okay, Wolf by Wolf is Yael's point of view, part of the story, and then Blood for Blood just sort of like explodes out from there, and the world kind of breaks open and becomes a lot bigger, and we get more characters' perspectives and stuff in Blood for Blood, and that was definitely done on purpose.
Did you ever feel like it's going to be hard to keep up the momentum in Blood for Blood, considering how fast-paced the first book was?
It's a different kind of story for sure. Like because the motorcycle race is built into Wolf by Wolf, it had a very natural pacing where it's like you're always going, and the race kind of lends a certain element of urgency to that. And then Blood for Blood kind of tackles Yael's how at the end she's completed her initial mission and she's thrown all of who she is into that. And then it doesn't quite turn out the way she expects, and so she kind of feels lost and doesn't know how to proceed from there. Even the world is still chaos around her, and so Blood for Blood kind of tackles that feeling of not, like, having kind of like of reshaping your own identity when life doesn't turn out the way you expect it to. So it's sort of like tackling that lost feel. And so I feel like the pacing also reflects that, and I think a lot of readers who read Wolf by Wolf first and were like, yeah, adrenaline, that. They go into Blood for Blood and they're like, wait a minute, this isn't the same feeling, and it was never meant to be the same feeling. But yeah, as a writer, I think I was actually just talking to people about this, but I read a lot of the books that I grew up loving in my childhood, and now when I go back and read them, I realize like the pacing is very slow. Like characters spend like 3 chapters drinking a cup of tea and stuff like that, and now I'm like, I feel like there's so much pressure in YA now to be like fast, pace. And that's it's good sometimes, but not always. And so I want to try to find a balance of like telling the story that I need to tell, but also keeping readers engaged.
So without giving too much away, can you briefly summarise the turmoil that Yael is now going to face in Blood for Blood?
Yeah, so as I said at the end of Wolf by Wolf, Yael completes her initial mission that she's given by the Resistance, and what she has really just worked her entire life toward. Everything inside her has built up to this one moment, and this moment happens, and then all hell breaks loose after that. And so she kind of, Blood for Blood is how she has to reconcile who she is outside of this one single goal. Like Wolf by Wolf is very much a revenge tale, and so Yael has her like assumed revenge, and so this is kind of the point of like what happens after, because I feel like a lot of narratives ends at the I have my revenge. And so, yeah, she's kind of forced to face that, but also she's forced to face her own preconceived notions about people. She meets 2 characters in Wolf by Wolf, Felix and Luca, and she immediately assumes things about them because of the context of their meeting, who they are. But as we get deeper and deeper into Blood for Blood, she starts to realize like that these boys aren't necessarily who she first thought they were. And so, just as Wolf by Wolf deals with identity by Yael's ability to skin shift and change faces, Blood for Blood kind of continues that exploration into identity by getting into the minds. I let the reader get into the minds of these minor characters who they only saw through Yael's eyes in the first book, and so now we get to explore and see their inner lives and their paths in Blood for Blood.
Do you think that this time around Yael was more realised as a character? It felt like her emotions were more powerful, more tangible in this book. It's as if she'd grown through her experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I just took her to a different place, and it's funny because when readers ask, they're like, "How do you make up characters?" I always tell them, and this sounds a little bit crazy, but I feel like the characters introduce themselves to me and make themselves known to me, and it's like through the writing process that I meet them and discover them. And so you go through a journey with characters in one book, and you feel like, okay, I figured all I can. I've known all I can about them. But then the challenge in the second book is to up the stakes and to push characters forward in a way. And the challenge is to find new ways to transform their characters. And so the fact that you think that I did, it means that I did my job well. So I'm glad.
So as we move on to Yael and her relationships with her friends and foe, did you always know that Yael and her connections with specific characters such as Luca would develop?
Yes, so I knew that before I even started Wolf by Wolf, because I planned the books out pretty specifically before I started writing them, because I sold them on a synopsis, and so I had to kind of tell the publisher, hey, this is what I'm planning on writing, so it wouldn't be a complete surprise when it ended up in their inbox. But there are definitely things that changed. So the ending of Blood for Blood was originally very different in my head than how it turned out. That's the thing about the writing process is as much planning as you can do, sometimes the story just kind of takes a life of its own and starts steering the way, and you have to just sort of follow it. But yes, Yael's relationship with Luca and her relationship with Felix, I always knew that it would go deeper than her initial meaning. I mean, I think Felix in Wolf by Wolf, Felix is he's portrayed as and he is a person who would literally do anything for his sister and literally do anything for his family. and those are very good traits in Wolf by Wolf, or perceived as good traits. And he still maintains those traits in Blood for Blood, but they're kind of turned against our protagonists and our heroes, and so it's easy to get super angry with him. And then Luca, he also continues to have his traits of I will do anything to get my end goal, but those are also flipped on their heads in Blood for Blood. So those were both very intentional, kind of like reversals. Like you keep the characters' traits the same, but the story kind of twists them into flipping them on their heads.
And due to the romantic elements touched upon, some refer to this as a coming-of-age story. Do you think that's fair, or does it downplay the significance of the other components of the story being told?
You know, I think it is definitely a coming-of-age story, but I don't know if it's because of the romance. Like the romance for me is a very kind of sideline sort of thing. It's not the main intention of the series. It's not even romance so much as it is like love. I think those are two different things, and I think these characters, they grow to have feelings for each other and to have affection for each other in a time where that is like literally like the last thing on people's minds, and it's such a hard world where this alternate history where the Axis powers won. It's a very hard world, and so you need some sort of glimmer of hope in that, and you need I think that's one of the reasons I was so attracted to World War II as a child, was because in that time, when you're like reading all of the stories and everything that comes out of that, you see humanity at its utmost worst, like for genocide and evil things. But then you also see the flip side of that. You see heroism and sacrifice and what people will do in the name of love, and I think that's very powerful. And so I think I had to put that in there as part of the storyline. But yeah, Elle's coming of age, I think, is her growth of figuring out who she is past revenge and who she is outside of suffering. So yeah, I guess it then ties into that. But I like to put myself in a circle.
A lot of the readers have commended Yael for not being your typical badass heroine, that she's got a softer side to her that's always exposed to us. Was this deliberate to add more dimensions to her and her approach to the readers?
Yes. So one of the things that always grated me a little bit was the term strong female character, because I think, towards the beginning of that movement, we weren't used to women being portrayed outside of like the stereotypical like feminine. So like when the strong characters like Katniss and others like kind of barreled into literature, and they're like, I can kill people, I can kick ass. Like we were like, yes, and then but it started grating on me a little bit, because that became their only defining trait of like their physical strength. And they were shown to be strong because they could act like women. But I feel like women are so much more layered and so much more complex, and our strength comes from so many different places outside of physical strength. And so I wanted to show a character who was very strong and very capable physically, but also had an emotional resilience, but was also could be vulnerable, because I think there's a lot of strength in the ability to be vulnerable as well. So I wanted to add those layers so that readers could see that it's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to have emotions. Like, that doesn't mean that you're not strong. In fact, it can mean you're stronger because you're willing to share those things.
Are you saying you've got 11 on it?
There's a lot of twists that we've had to endure along the way of this alternative tale, ones that some of us might not get experienced. Was it hard to write those scenes and to see the fates of your characters so brutally laid out before you? And if so, would you ever tempted to change the story to ensure they didn't come to an end?
So I talked a little bit about this, but I had a happily ever after ending to the series planned out. But then as I was writing the story, I slowly began to realize that, and especially in World War II tales, like, you can't not have sacrifice, especially in a time as violent as this. you know, every decision has a consequence and war has costs. And so not everyone could have that happily ever after ending. And so, yeah, I have a lot of readers come up to me after they finish the duology and they're like, how could you? or they'll be like, I just finished reading. And I'm like, are you okay? And they're like, no, I'm not. In all honesty, like, I told them I also wasn't okay with it. Like, it was very hard. There was a chapter toward the end of Blood for Blood that, like, literally every time I wrote it or edited it or worked on it, I was, like, sobbing the whole time, and it hurt me just as much as it hurt readers, and I know people won't believe that because I did it, but you know, I think the story wouldn't have had the same effect or the same resonance if I'd written it any other way, and so that was a sacrifice that I had to make for the story. Yes, it makes me very sad.
Going off of that, was there any particular characters that you connected with on a far deeper level, such as Yael, that they became more than just a character on a page to you?
Yeah, and Yael's voice became very naturally to me. I wanted to write her in a way that was almost like, her voice has kind of like a fairy tale quality, but in a twisted sort of way, that she lives in this world that's not quite that way, which is why it started off Once Upon a Different Time. There was a girl who lived in the kingdom of death. And so, like, that sort of way of seeing the world, I really enjoyed writing her passages, especially in Blood for Blood when I started switching up characters' voices and stuff. Felix actually was the hardest one. He came the least naturally to me. But yeah, it's been several years now since I've written it, and I do miss writing Yael. I miss her voice. I miss her determination. I miss, yeah, there's a lot of things about her that I wish I could keep writing some stuff, but also I feel like her story is complete, so.
Was it difficult writing Blood for Blood from 3 different perspectives?
Yeah, so Felix, I had a lot of writer's block with Felix because in the first draft I tried to force him to become a person that he wasn't, and it wasn't until I finally let go of his character and let him make his own, albeit terrible decisions sometimes, like that writer's block finally like came free. But back to like some characters, I also really came to love Luca because his sense of humor, and it was like super irreverent sometimes, but he had this levity that really I needed as I was writing these books. He would just like crack jokes and stuff, and I was like, oh, finally I can laugh, and like, it's, you know, just to, yeah, he added levity, and he became my favorite character of the series.
And even though there's like a fantasy element to this story, the characters seem to resonate so perfectly with modern day life. Their emotions, actions, the darkness that they endure. Do you think this is why your book is so well received? Because it transcends when and where it's set?
Possibly. That's actually one of my goals as a writer. Is I obviously, as I said before, I love history, but I also want to write stories that feel timeless. I think there's definitely a technique and a I've started to say a word that I don't think is good. It's very deliberate. But yeah, I think because it is in its own sort of like timeline and bubble and weird sphere, I think that it does have that timelessness to it. But I also think that history isn't quite as distant as we tend to think it is. When several years ago I did a tour of Pompeii in Italy, and one of the things on the tour that they show you is they take you around and they'll like show you the walls, and they say, oh yeah, so here's this graffiti that these like ancient Romans did, and it's all like this lewd, crude, like people are like cussing each other out, and they're like, and so you read that and you're like, oh wow, like people in history were actually a lot like people today, like, you know, and I think we like to look back at history and think that people were somehow different, or but not, no. So I think that's one of the reasons where I tried to evoke that. Like, there's a lot of things that transcend both culture and time, and it's, you know, the ability to love, like, hopes and fears and dreams. Like, everyone throughout all of history has had all of those things. So,
And before we go, can you just give us a little taster of what's to come in your new book, Invictus?
Yes.
We've seen shots of the front cover, but we're dying to know more.
yes. So, after I finished writing Wolf by Wolf and Blood for Blood, it took me about 3 years to work on that, and it was a very, very heavy sort of tale. I mean, just to go to my desk every day and sit down and imagine this landscape. It was like, frankly, it was very exhausting, and by the time I had completed that series, I was ready to just write something that wasn't death or blood or death or war. And so I had this idea in my brain because of a short story prompt that I had written a long time ago. But so Invictus is it's basically a fandom homage to my love of both Doctor Who and Firefly, and so it's time traveling thieves, and it's set in a future where humanity has discovered time travel, but because time travel has they put a lot of rules, and so you can only go back to observe. You can't interact with history whatsoever. You know, if you screw anything up. And so the main character, his name is Faraway Gaius McCarthy. He is the son of a time traveler who broke one of these rules and fell in love with a gladiator in ancient Rome and became pregnant. And so she gave birth to him on a time machine as it was going back to the future. And so he was born outside of time. He doesn't have a birthday. And he believes that it's his destiny to go explore the past, and he's just very driven, and he wants to be a time traveler more than anything in the world. And so he goes to the time traveling academy. He gets high marks. He's like top of his class. But at the very end, just as he's taking his final exams, something goes terribly wrong in the simulation, and he fails. He flunks out, and so you don't get second chances when it comes to time travel. And so he gets kicked out of the academy, and he believes that all of his dreams are crushed and over. Until later that evening, he gets a letter from someone saying, "Come, like, meet me at this time and location." So he does, and it turns out to be a guy who works on the black markets. He has stolen time machines, and he sends people back to get sundries like cheese and wine and chocolate and things that you couldn't necessarily get fresh in the future. And he says, "You're actually a very talented time traveler, and so I need someone. I have a ship. I need someone to go back in time and steal antiquities that were destroyed by history, steal things that won't be missed." And so I was like, "Of course, I will be. I'll do this for you." So he assembles a crew, and they go back in time, and they start stealing items that were destroyed or lost in wars, or things that were lost to history. And so we first meet the crew on the Titanic, and they're stealing a book known as the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and the heist goes terribly, terribly wrong, and the story goes out from there. So yeah, that's just a taste of what Invictus is. It is a very shiny book, and I like shiny things, as I'm sure you can tell.
This book sounds incredible, and I can't wait to read it. Thank you so much for answering my questions
Thanks
today.